Assemblyman Brian Kolb on the line right now. Brian, good morning. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure, Bill.
Sorry you got in the mix of the music medley, but hey, it is what it is.
Did you know those songs?
I was going to guess myself.
You were going to guess.
Yeah.
Well, you got to take a shot. And by the way, UFC tickets. Hard to believe we're finally saying UFC in Albany. That's big.
It certainly is. It took way too long to get there, but we got there, and nothing. All the good things that happen in Albany take a way long time, and all the bad things happen very quickly. It's amazing.
Brian, of course, has been unanimously reelected as GOP minority leader in the Assembly, and so listen, you're the longest tenured GOP minority leader in the legislature. Is that correct?
Well, I'm the longest tenured legislative leader in the entire legislature right now because I've been serving as a legislative leader longer than anybody else due to the vacated positions of leaders that have been, quite frankly, unfortunately, convicted of crimes while they were held their positions.
Well, Trump is taking credit for draining the swamp, but he recently asked the real swamp drainer, Preet Bharara, to stay on, and he has agreed. This guy has really shaken things up in Albany, and there's got to be a movement to clean things up at this point.
Well, there's no doubt about it. Preet Bharara is doing his job like any other federal prosecutor should be doing their job across this country. And I think that there has been a sense at times where I think the general public thinks that the rules don't apply equally to everyone, and that some people that are in different political positions get a break, and the normal citizen would not. And I think that Preet Bharara has single-handedly proven that that's not the case here in New York State.
You're in a tough position. We've certainly talked to Mark Butler and Claudia Tenney about being Republican in a Democrat-controlled assembly, but there has to be an upstate coalition that is maintained here when it comes to our values are so different than downstate. It's a challenge.
It certainly is, and I absolutely agree with you. I think that Republican and Democrat legislators from upstate, and you can always try to figure out what that line is, but some would say it's north of Ulster County or north and east and west of Westchester County. But clearly, there needs to be more of a concerted effort by all of us on both sides of the aisle because the policies have become, in general, too dominant by New York City. In the New York State Assembly, you have 63 or 65 members of 150 members that represent New York City. And that's where the block begins. And then if you add in the urban areas of Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, Albany, and that's where those more liberal urban policies take foothold.
And there's some crazy, just some crazy things that have been proposed out of New York City. And we look up here and we're just shaking our heads. How could this stuff even be proposed? And it's baffling, but it is just a different lifestyle. And of course, when it comes to the Second Amendment, I know that Assemblyman Butler has tried to move forward with legislation that would, basically saying if the legislature and the governor can look at minimum wage and draw a line and say, well, this is New York and this is upstate, why couldn't we have a different application of the SAFE Act, upstate versus New York City?
Well, we can if we wanted to. And when I say want to, that would have to be an effort not only just by the legislature, but by the governor himself.
Yeah.
Keep in mind that the governor single-handedly made the SAFE Act happen by convincing 4 Senate Republicans to go along with this law. Mm-hmm. And, of course, it was done in the dead of night. There were no public hearings. And Governor Cuomo was trying to showboat by being the first governor to come up with gun laws after the tragedy in Connecticut with the mass shooting. And so there's so many policies, Bill, that should be left up to the regions themselves and differentiate based on, what works
Yep.
In Central New York versus the Southern Tier versus Western New York versus Finger Lakes versus North Country. We should have more independent views and allow those regions to survive and to blossom separate from New York City.
Yeah, I want to bring up something that's personal to me and anybody who's had kids in school. You're from Canandaigua. My wife, by the way, is from Canandaigua. Upstate schools, when it comes to funding, it's a real issue. There are wealthy schools upstate, wealthy districts upstate, but for the most part, the distribution of funding is a real problem. When do we get the formula fixed? And do you see any of that possibly coming to fruition in 2017?
Well, I just recently wrote a letter to the State Education Commissioner about that very fact, that we need to take a look at the disparity in the formula and funding. And again, upstate schools, the poor school districts, the rural school districts, do not have the same amount of opportunity for their children in terms of class offerings and class sizes. And this is something that's always been a political football bill, because no legislator in any other part of the state wants to give up the funding that they're getting. So, for instance, Long Island says, well, I feel bad for those poor districts upstate, but as a state legislator, I'm not going to advocate to shift any money from one place to another. Yeah. So that's really part of the crux of the problem, is how you get everybody saying, hey, we got to look out for everybody, not just our own parochial interest.
And something, the governor, of course, this week vetoing a ton of different pieces of legislation. One that baffles me, there's the credit card or maybe a debit card being used for charitable raffles and stuff. I guess I can understand. I think it was the wrong decision by him, in my opinion. But this this farm to food bank to give special tax credits to farmers when they give leftover produce and what have you, products to charity. He vetoed that. Passed both the Assembly and the Senate. What's he thinking?
Well, I'm not sure, because there's a lot of things I don't understand what he's thinking when he does the things that he does. Yeah. I have not seen his veto message on this particular bill, but it's ridiculous. Why not, instead of having total loss of this food, why not encourage local farmers to help the food banks who need this food desperately? And it's not going to cost the food banks anything. I think it's just an additional incentive, and it certainly is not going to hurt the state coffers. Right. In any stretch of the imagination.
That's what he's saying.
So it makes no sense.
He says you come out of the budget that it's going to cost too much money for the state. I guess that's what he's saying. And then finally, Uber. Do you what are your thoughts for 2017 Uber upstate?
I absolutely believe it should happen. I believe it should have happened this past year. What you have is New York City. New York City has Uber, right?
Right, yeah.
But all of a sudden, the New York City area legislators are trying to put all these demands in terms of insurance coverage and safety protections, et cetera, but they're not doing anything about New York City. And this is another great example where New York City and the legislators that are there are trying to dictate the things that should or shouldn't happen in the rest of the state. And I think this is why they're clueless and need to start taking more of a hands-off approach policy to what's good for upstate versus downstate.
All right. Reelected as GOP minority leader in the New York State Assembly, Assemblyman Brian Kolb. Brian, thanks so much for coming on this morning.
My pleasure, Bill.
All right. Have a great holiday, by the way.
You too. Thank you.
We got a break.